Hey, everybody. It is Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and welcome once again to Uncivil Disobedience with me, my co host Kennedy Cooper, and our guest Sarah Ashton, who is running for City Council in Las Vegas and who has a couple of nice stories for us from outside the campaign, too. But go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. So, as Chris said, I'm Sarah Ashton. I'm running for Las Vegas City Council Ward 6, which encompasses approximately 120,000 residents and about 80,000 voters. So, we're talking about a pretty big race. And ultimately, I decided to run due to the fact that I've lived in Vegas for 17 years. And yet, during those 17 years, I've progressed, but the city itself hasn't. And thanks to a mixture of my analytics background, my understanding of healthcare, and most specifically, my ability to not be scared when my Republican opponents throw punches at me, I felt now was the time to run and to win. And so it's a true pleasure, Chris and Kennedy, to be on the show. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for your time. This is going to be a fun one, I think.
Definitely.
Well, I know it's my pleasure to have you on. I enjoy your takes, and I have definitely been enjoying I was definitely enjoying the Ruth Gaos drama while it lasted.
So I'm not sure how many of your audience members know about Ruth Gaos from Louisville, Kentucky, but Ruth is a fundamentalist preacher working in a church where they believe trans people are responsible for, what's the word, Kennedy? It's the end or something that they told us of the trans.
We are a result of the fall.
The fall, that's the word. Yes, thank you.
And they'll say a lot of funny stuff about this because they'll be like, well, a lot of things are a result of the fall. But we know what you mean when you word it that way. Don't play games.
So I see Chris laughing back there. One of the ways, and we're going to get to this, and it's not just the Proud Boys, but one of the ways I was able to infiltrate the GOP and beat them at their own game. And by the way, I'm still beating you guys in the GOP, and the results will be seen forthcoming. However, Saul Alinsky, it was truly one of my role models when it came to people who are willing to stir things up. And as Alinsky said, when it came to the fall, I guess Satan was the first revolutionary.
Well, that's one way to look at it. It's true.
Yeah. I don't know. There's a lot of funny stuff with that. And there's definitely a lot of, I don't know. I fight with the Christians on Twitter as much as I can because I just like being a queer jerk who knows the Bible. Oh, nothing could be better.
Fundamentally, and pun intended, fundamentally, Christians should appreciate us more than anyone, meaning queer folks, due to the fact that you're supposed to love those who are most in need, right? And they're supposed to need to save us and love us no matter what. And ultimately, something's been lost along the way. And that is one of the saddest parts of organized religion, is that...
I'm going to talk about a liberal without being insulting for a moment.
This is unusual, folks.
Liberal as his politics might be, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove has written some very excellent things about slaveholder religion and how essentially he's talking about white American Christianity, but I would extrapolate beyond it to white European Christianity in general, which is just saying that it's lost the basic actual connection to the Jesus of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
The biblical Jesus is not connected in any way to a lot of evangelical, fundamentalist, Pentecostal, etc. churches. That they've created their own sort of belief system that doesn't require the Jesus of the Bible, and then inserted their white American Jesus into the empty space.
Yeah, at least the Mormons are honest about it. They're like, yeah, we want white American Jesus, just explicitly. Well, okay. At least you told it like it is.
Mentioned white American Jesus, I thought of the LDS as well, because you can't go anywhere without seeing their radiant picture of white Jesus sitting there in all of his glory.
Yep. Chris, it's great that you point this out, because really, when you look at a church like Ruth Gaos' church, it couldn't be clearer that this is true, that there's no real basis, that this is a constructed set of, I like to actually refer to a lot of this stuff as biblical fan fiction. Like, it probably starts with like maybe stuff like Dante's Inferno, which is literally biblical fan fiction, but is also like the picture that people have in their heads of hell, realistically. So, this stuff influences people a lot. And in the literature for Ruth Gaos' church, where it's explaining that they're transphobic, homophobic, misogynistic, etc., there's no references to the Bible. There's no reference. This is the Bible verse that backs up this horrible belief that we're telling you is crucial.
Well, so let's say something here, because let's talk about and this is let's talk about where that stuff in the Bible comes from. It comes from a narrow set of passages in Exodus and Leviticus, some of which are repeated again in Deuteronomy. So we're talking about a few passages in at most 3 books of the Bible. And what it says is to kill men who dress like women, to kill men who sleep with other men, and there's another one. No, it doesn't actually say that, though, so never mind. There isn't, despite the fact that that Christians desperately try to make it so. There is actually nothing explicitly against masturbation in the Bible, even the worst parts of the Old Testament, to the point that the part that people have to go to try to make anything in the Bible sound anti-masturbation is they have to go back to the story of Onan, who spilled his seed upon the ground in order to keep from getting his wife pregnant.
No, sorry, his brother's wife.
Well, no. So this is under the rules of the time, and this is actually there in the laws later on, but was custom in the tribes of the area even before then. But under the laws of the time, you married your brother's widow, so that she would not be sent home to her family in disgrace. Because a widow was considered a drain on a family. And so it was the responsibility of the husband's family to provide the widow with another husband so that she was taken care of. Which is just another way of patriarchal paternalism rearing its head. But that was how their culture saw that. So Onan married his brother's widow because his brother was dead.
Correct.
And then he spilled his seed upon the ground to avoid getting her pregnant, because the first child he got her pregnant with would be his dead brother's kid and not his. And he didn't want to have his dead brother's kid. He was selfish. He would rather not have kids than give his dead brother an heir.
And so in God's eyes, he was failing to fulfill the commitment to the family.
And so God struck him dead. But now, let's be really clear here. We're not talking about masturbation. We're talking about coitus interruptus. That's number one. And number two, we're talking about a very specific situation. So this doesn't even work for the no birth control people. This wasn't the coitus interruptus, the birth control, wasn't the crime against God. It was not giving his dead brother an heir, which was his duty as the next son.
you're going to find this again and again with a lot of these things that we're talking about. Things have been cherry picked, pulled out of context to the extent that, like I said, in these horrible, bylaws for this awful church, they won't even reference the Bible directly. They won't in your bylaws. Like, what is the basis of your bylaws then? If it's not the Bible, what is it? You're going to make me sound like I'm about to accuse you of Satanism.
Well, on that note, the full burqa, as popularized by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and genital mutilation, as practiced by certain tribes in the Sudan and the Arabian Peninsula, are not Muslim customs. They are cultural customs of groups that became Muslim and then used their religion to justify later their own cultural baggage that they brought with them into the religion. White Christians are no different, my friends.
Yeah. So, if you actually investigate the Bible, you'll find that none of this stuff really holds up. Even the thing about like a man not laying with a man, there's a number of different ways to translate that section. And it's been popularly translated one way, but it could also be translated as telling someone not to be a pedophile potentially. And it could also be translated as just saying don't cheat on people. So there's like, there's just a whole game that these people play when they pretend to have an authority on this information.
I'm going to go ahead and say something that the people who debunk the Bible have said a lot, which is, or who debunk what certain kinds of Christians say in the Bible, which is there is a difference perhaps between the view of LGBTQ plus people of a nomadic society who needs as many kids as possible to keep itself going, and that between a settled urban society that has plenty of people. And you're going to see a much higher degree of prejudice for men who won't have kids in a society that relies on more kids and sees having a son as this duty that every son has to his father. And so even in that situation, you can see how all the homophobic attitudes seep in. But the reason that I also specify in the beginning men lying with men, there is nothing in the Bible anywhere that says women can't lie with women. There is absolutely nothing in the Bible against lesbianism whatsoever. There is no mention other than men dressing up like women, which, and this is important to understand in the broader cultural context of the area in which people were developing their beliefs. Men dressing like women was a specific custom in certain churches of certain other Canaanite deities of the period. So what we're doing here when we're saying men don't dress like women is we're saying set yourself automatically apart as different from the priests of those other Canaanite gods who you're too smart to worship anyway, or else I'll smite you. So it's not even about necessarily the guy dressing up like a woman at a party. It's about this very specific situation where you will be seen as a priest of a very different kind of deity if you dress that way.
Well, and it changes later in the Bible.
Yes.
Because there is a famous character in the Bible that dresses up as a woman and saves the Hebrews by doing so. You might not know this story this way, but this is what it actually is. I'm talking about Joseph.
Oh, yes, definitely.
But that might have to be for another time. We might have to do an episode about queer figures in the Bible, though, because they exist.
Well, so let's be honest here. David and Jonathan loved each other more than either one of them loved anyone else. We all know what that means, especially when they were in the military together.
Guys that are pals.
Very close pals. It's like Martin Van Buren. Let's talk about queer folks in history. Martin Van Buren was married. He had a wife. He was not. There was only one bachelor in the White House, and it wasn't him. And yet he was married with his best friend, not his wife. That's a very radical departure from the usual custom. And you have to ask yourself why. You can't know for certain, but why?
Mm-hmm. Why indeed?
But no, David and Jonathan are definitely very underrated queer figures from the Bible, as are Jesus and John. How does the alleged apostle himself, in referring to himself in the gospel named after him, call himself the disciple that Jesus loved? That's just something to think about.
Oh, Sarah, what's on your mind besides biblical assholes? What else is going on in your world politically?
I don't know, Kennedy. I'm appreciating this conversation. When I said that I would be open to anything and it's completely uncensored, I think a lot of politicians would be squirming right now. But in fact, I can't wipe the smile off my face. Ultimately, this is how you get to the heart of really understanding somebody in who they are, right? And for me, having grown up, actually, I finished high school at 15, and I went off to college very early, and I had my first male relationship, male on male, and lost my virginity. And shortly thereafter, I was placed into hospital for conversion therapy.
Oh my God.
At 16. So I saw it from within the Christian-based situation. It was a Catholic liberal arts school that led into a seminary. And I was devastated because as a freshman, I wasn't invited to the wine and cheese party. And then ultimately I was able to, lose my virginity to a very handsome Nigerian American. And he was young too. Turned out he ended up more queer than me, which is hard to do. But at the time, he was definitely the butch one. So I don't know if I can use that term, but he was definitely the masculine one. Ultimately, though, I saw it at a very young age. The repercussions of what would take place within, as Chris mentioned, these patriarchal systems and the systems of religion where it's allowed as long as you do it within the confines and acceptance of that sort of societal vertical. Mm-hmm. And so everyone was doing it, and people had gone to those schools, and even the seminarians were having relations with the undergrads, et cetera. And it broke my heart looking back, because a lot of those men who may have been caught up in scandal, I don't mean the pedophiles, but just the men who were caught up sleeping with other guys as priests, ultimately, if they would have been freer within the church system, it wouldn't have brought so much shame to the church. And they maybe would have been better ministers, because obviously I think the three of us agree, if you're going to be a minister, life experience matters. Mm-hmm. And being queer shouldn't.
And if you're repressing yourself, the odds of you teaching a repressive gospel kind of go up.
Let's look at some folks. I mean, John Calvin was thrown out of a lot of places for what he was trying to preach. And when he found a place where he could settle down, he immediately started persecuting everybody who did not accept his word as law. So, I mean, it's important to understand that this stuff perpetuates itself in a cycle. whether we're talking about churches or whether we're talking about abuse in families, because everybody knows kids who have been beat or kids who have been inappropriately touched are that much more likely to beat or inappropriately touch their own kids.
Yes. Yes. It's systemic. It's as systemic as the systemic racism we deal with. It's systemic as the systemic poverty we deal with, is that systemic abuse that comes from repressive nature. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think that's where the greatest failing of organized religion is, especially within the Christian sects that present themselves as mainstream Protestantism or Catholicism, is that they are collapsing upon themselves or into themselves, I should say.
Where do you get, I mean, I still don't see, and this is again why I got to go back to Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove and his slaveholder religion. Where do you get the version of Jesus and God that we see now in our society from the New Testament? I mean, Jesus is hanging out with beggars and lepers and sex workers and fishermen and tax collectors. It's all very dodgy. And he was criticized for hanging out with these people.
I've spent a lot of time in Haiti, pre and post earthquake. And ultimately, while I was down there, while I dealt a lot with the general populace, you had all of these NGOs. And in addition to the NGOs, which were grift machines as though it's inconceivable, even worse than that were the folks who would go down there and still attempt to buy souls. And one of the most shameful aspects of what I saw in Hispaniola, in Haiti, specifically in the country of Haiti, a little bit in Dominican, was, you mentioned leprosy. You still have some leprosy in Haiti, right? It's not as though leprosy is gone. And these people, these ministers, would specifically go out of their way not to deal with the lepers. While the Bible talks about, as you just mentioned, Chris, embracing the lepers and embracing the working women and embracing those who were the most downtrodden and the most rejected. And in Haiti, it was the opposite, specifically regarding the lepers, but also prostitutes as well.
Yeah.
And what you would see is very simple. If you wanted to have some food at night and you wanted to be able to have some fresh water and maybe a little bit of entertainment, tiny bit of electricity, give us your soul. That's it. Mm-hmm. But you're only going to give us your soul if you're dressed in your clean pants, your Sunday best dress. If you are just showing up in rags, you are an insult to many of these preachers and many of these missionaries. Mm-hmm. Whereas though those are the people who you want to say, come in and let us embrace you, let us hold you, let us bring you to our bosoms.
And they lie. I remember a friend of mine had a moment of disillusionment with a church that he ultimately left. And he's still a believer, but he doesn't belong to that church anymore because he went on a mission as a teenager and they told him beforehand, we're going to go to the neediest people. We're going to go preach to the lepers, etc. So they went to India where there are plenty of very needy people, plenty of actual lepers, plenty of homeless people, you know. And what happened? Oh, they just had like a bougie vacation. Yeah. And the priest, you know, that took them there was like, oh, actually, we're not going to do any of that stuff. But the whole time leading up to it, he's telling them, we're going to go to the heart of the people who need it. And so my buddy was like, huh, that was a weird trip. I don't know how I feel about this organization anymore because they're talking out both sides of their mouth. And if you're paying any attention at all, you see it. But if you just want to be a white savior and jerk yourself off, then you don't.
This is where I will point out that since we mentioned the LDS Church before, the LDS Church actually sends people on actual missions to actual places where they do actual things, whether you always like what they do or not. And
I'm glad you're bringing that up because you mentioned how it's bougie vacations, right? Mm-hmm. And having lived in Nevada where we have a tremendous amount of LDS population and we're neighbors with Utah, I do have a considerable amount of experience with the LDS Church. I even went through deep into their missionary process where the elders attempted to convert us, and it wasn't for me. It wasn't for my ex-partner. However, I did appreciate the time and energy and effort they put into that, right? But I just saw a news report today that, and I might be way off on my numbers, but the Vatican admitted to owning something of over 5,000 properties. And that's just the Vatican itself. That doesn't mean the different diocesan land holdings. So it's easy to be bougie when you are literally an untaxed monolith across the globe, not just trading in arts and artifacts, but in land holdings as well.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the
Vatican Bank is a big deal.
An old deal and a shady deal all the way back.
To the point where there is such a well-known conspiracy theory about John Paul I's heart attack that they actually made it a subplot in the third Godfather movie.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. If the Catholic Church owes you money, if you are able to get yourself in that position, you might think, well, I'm on top of the world now. No, you're dead. I just want to specify how history works, okay? But I want to go back to talking about the cycle of abuse a little bit, because we're talking about these institutions, and I think something that a lot of people struggle with, especially when we're having conversations like abolish the police, and people are pushing back on ideas that at this point should not even seem controversial given what we're dealing with. I think it's one of the things that people do is they fail to recognize the cycle of abuse also works systemically. It's not just the grandfather that beats the father that beats the son. That's one type of cycle of abuse. But you can also have a cycle of abuse that's a system. And when you're dealing with that, you can't just say, oh, we're gonna make it work with this system, in the same way that you can't just make it work with the partner who is abusing you at home.
Sure. It's much harder to move. Oh, sorry, Kennedy.
No, you go ahead.
It's much harder to move an entire organization, an entire system, as you put it. You can get away from an abuser, right? You can maybe break that cycle. But can you truly break multiple chains that are enslaving you when, yes, you might be able to break the one chain, but it's much more difficult to play Houdini when you're wrapped in all these different directions. And ultimately, you're also being told while you're wrapped, why are you trying to escape? Somebody can see a woman who's beaten by their husband. Somebody can see a child who's perpetually abused by their parent. It's very visible. But when the entire system is based on a gaslighting notion that you're wrong, as you just mentioned, Kennedy, nobody should be questioning some of these debates that we're having. We shouldn't even be having debates on them. And yet they look at us. No, you're bad for society. You're the ones that want more crime. And meanwhile, you have something such as qualified immunity, which is literally a license to murder. And people look at us like we're crazy. And when I say us, anybody who's willing to speak out against that systemic notion of abuse that you've pointed out.
Yeah. It's really serious, and you can't fix a system that's doing that. Because it's not just abusing you externally, internally, it's abusing everyone too to maintain itself as well. And so all of those people, can't be simply just, put back into society necessarily, because they're also abused by this system. And if I'm worried about putting them back into society, we definitely can't just retrain them and then give them their guns back.
Last week, so a little bit of background. I had never been called an activist in my life until the last 3 months. Now, I'd done activist work. I protested at Occupy, did a tremendous amount of work down in Haiti, Argentina, around the world. I traveled with Muslim refugees. So I was very much within the activist community, but I had never been called an activist. I am an analyst by trade. Despite the gender, very much mainstream, very progressive, but mainstream. Once all the news stories started to break about what happened with me in the GOP, and there's a lot more to come, all of a sudden I'm being labeled an activist. And I realized, I'm going to beep it out. I'm just going to lean into it. And it's then when I looked around and saw other candidates who were trying to play both sides, right? They wanted to appear as though the establishment would embrace them while throwing out slogans on Twitter, right? Keyboard warriors, but even worse, because they would cozy up to those who they felt would put them into positions of responsibility and respect and respectability. There was a murder of a gentleman by the name of Jorge Gomez in 2020, summer of 2020 in Las Vegas. He was shot, not pointing a weapon. And in fact, they did a police inquiry and they said he wasn't pointing a weapon at anyone, but there was still no murder charges. We go down and there's a justice forum sponsored by the NAACP. However, there is FBI agents, U.S. attorney, sheriff, district attorney. I called up the organizers, this brave group, and you can look them up, give shout out to in solidarity to More Than a Hashtag, which is in Las Vegas. And it's brown and black women who basically take the lead in trying to point out a lot of this oppression from the police. We go in there and take a front and center seat. They see us, they're starting to squirm. What happens? They stop the forum to lecture the leaders of this organization and to lecture me. And there's maybe 10 or 12 of us. So what they did in that moment was they didn't just perpetuate the abuse. They literally blamed the abused for being abused while protecting the abuser in hopes of trying to garner whatever respectability they could. And in reality, just allowing yet another cycle of abuse to take place. These were murderers. Steve Wolfson, that's the district attorney. You're an accomplice to murder. Joe Lombardo, the sheriff who's running for governor, I'm looking at you and I'll say it again. And I was in the front row, I held up my sign. Joe Lombardo, not only should you never be governor, you should be in jail as an accomplice to murder. And those 4 police officers, the sheriff's deputies that were there working under you, you are murderers. You got away with it this time, but eventually the system will change, and ultimately justice, a fair, right, and truthful justice will prevail, because systemically the change is happening, and it will happen, and we will find justice, and we'll find equity and equality. And the people who are going to pay the biggest price for it are those, getting back to a biblical term, are those who have been lukewarm, because they will be spit out. I would rather deal with Republicans. I would rather deal with the enemy we know than those who are trying to curry favor, and then ultimately we'd be the first to take that knife and put it into us, or to sell us out for less than 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah. It's tough to know outside the left who your allies are. Sometimes it's tough to know inside the left who your allies are too. But that's another matter. Sometimes.
It really is. That's its own show on itself, and we would have to actually do a show about Twitter if we did that.
Oh God. Yeah. But in terms of like trying to find allies on the outside, we know that hardcore fascists are pretty much unreachable. Now, there are some people that are able to do anti-fascist deprogramming. More power to you. I'm not one of them. I'm a marginalized person. A lot of my friends are the same. So we don't do that work. But if that's your work, that's great. But for the rest of us, when we're looking at sort of mainstream working class folks trying to find allies, I do sometimes find it easier, and I talk about this pretty openly, to bring someone to my side that on the surface identifies as just like a soft conservative than somebody who's just like a soft liberal, because that soft conservative will usually agree that the system isn't working. And that's a great way to have conversations. But that liberal who's just not that into politics, that's what I mean by soft in this sense, really. It's just not that into politics. I just kind of vote. That soft liberal, they're going to tell me all day that everything's fine. Joe Biden's doing a great job while 6 million people are being evicted.
Isn't Obamacare wonderful? It has a great name.
He didn't even expand it. He was supposed to at least do that. What the fuck?
I'll quote a different Democrat, but she seems very popular with a lot of liberals. The ACA benefit is better than the Medicare benefit.
That's all you can do. I don't know if you gentlemen saw it, or Kennedy, I'm not sure. What do you go by? What are your pronouns, Kennedy?
I use they, them.
Okay. Chris, gentleman, Kennedy, person, they, them. Ultimately, I don't know if you saw, but I did march for Medicare for All. And that's where we got the push, was from the soft liberals. Why would we be out there? And actually from some union members who worked so hard, and I stand with labor forever. And I get where they would be frustrated, where they worked very hard to extract a benefit, right? Say a Cadillac plan for healthcare. However, ultimately, how much more money could they extract if we had Medicare for All? Plus, they wouldn't have to hold it up there.
Plus, let's be really honest about this. Any benefit that comes to you through a union contract can be taken away through another union contract.
Or worse, they can just close shop.
Yes.
You're out. There's no other contract. You're done.
There are, well, let's take an example of a slightly different kind of union with a slightly different kind of situation, though, of course, there's still a blacklist. In Hollywood, the SAG-AFTRA set work minimums, saying you had to work enough to make X amount of money every year in order to use your union benefits for health care. And otherwise, you were losing your health care.
Yes.
People who were retired and hadn't worked in years, like Ellen Barkin, were like, oh my God, they took my benefits away. And they shouldn't be doing this to people, which is true. They shouldn't be, because they also took it away from a lot of hardworking actors who just don't make enough money from acting, and they need that health care that they pay their dues for.
And I believe it's something like 25 or 30,000 a year, if I'm correct, that they have to hit as a minimum.
Which means you have to be almost making a living at acting before the health care benefit kicks in, and that's not why they started paying dues.
Yeah. And let's be real, there are some of these lifelong union organizers, and I'm just going to say this just because Twitter be like this. I'm pro-labor as fuck. I'm pro-union as fuck. You can't be
pro-union.
Like, I love unions, okay? Let's do this. But there are some people in union organizing who have worked in union organizing their whole lives and have done nothing but bargain healthcare contracts. And they're scared because they don't know what the heck they would do if we change that. Their entire game right now, some of these people make pretty cushy salaries to just sit around doing this bargaining. And literally, for some of them, they don't bargain about anything else. They really don't. Healthcare is the only thing that they're consistently really talking with these bosses about. So they don't know, much like some of the Democrats, like Nancy Pelosi, who clearly doesn't know what she would do if Medicare for All were passed, which is like, get out, Nancy, you're going to hold power either way at this point. What's even wrong with you? But anyway, it's like much like that kind of mentality where she's so scared of it passing because it's been a part of her fundraising for 30 years. There are healthcare bargainers in union organizing that have that same shitty mentality.
And for the younger Twitter followers, and when I say younger, because ultimately there's a lot of people who might be in their early to mid 20s and don't have a tremendous amount of experience with unions, not with life, but with unions themselves, because unions are a dwindling form of employee collectives in 2021, unfortunately. But there are union bosses in Las Vegas that make $300,000 a year. I'm not certain how many people in the rank and file, let alone those who aren't in unions or have been exposed to them, understand that $200,000 to $300,000 a year is not an uncommon wage for union organizers.
Oh, I know.
You have to make your money somehow, and getting that healthcare plan and fighting for it is a good enough reason to be able to still make mid six figures.
Well, but that's the whole trouble too, is that, so how did we end up with union organizers making six figures? And once a union organizer makes six figures, are they still working class? Are their interests still the same as those of their rank and file? That's another show by itself.
I'm glad you brought this up. So I'm running for city council, running against this horrific grifter, subject of FBI investigation, as Chris and Kennedy know. However, I've received a tremendous amount of phone calls from the establishment because I can win this race. I probably will win this race. And it has the Democrats very scared. And they're torn between, and I'm a Democrat. Just like I love unions, I'm a Democrat. I'm a democratic socialist, but my party is Democrat. So ultimately, I've been getting these calls. Sarah, drop out. Check your ego. You're only going to win 22% of the vote, 25% of the vote. I tell them, I can get to the second round with 25% of the vote. And then what are you going to do? Not back me and back this woman? No, I'm the only one that can actually win. They're not going to elect a Republican light. So this woman, I'm not going to say her name, but she's.
Can I just interrupt really quick too? And
please go ahead. Yes.
Let's say you did only get 25% of the vote and you lost, and that was the end of it. Someone who gets 25% of the vote in their first election is extremely likely to win if they run a second time. That's the kind of numbers that shows extremely high potential as a candidate. So
thank you. They were talking, 20 or 25% within a 3 or 4 or 5-way race. Like, they have me slotted. They know where I'm at. Their argument is, as a progressive, I have a ceiling. And my statement is, Democrats will turn out for me where they're not going to turn out for you because you're just a moderate. But thank you very much, Kennedy. And yes, that's why I believe I will win, can win, and ultimately will be victorious, because when people are just giving me that number already, we can build off of it, especially with a year to go.
If they consider that the insult,
right?
I know some people that got like 12% the first time they ran and then won something later. I mean, like, if they consider 25% an insult, they know that you're a serious fucking candidate and they're scared.
They are. So this woman calls me, this person, I'm not going to, I just gave her gender away, but she was a rank and file in one union. Well, I'll say it. She's a principal now after having been a teacher. So in this phone call where she called me to tell me she's going to run against me, we had a nice call. She's very moderate. She said, you're too progressive for me. We're talking. I said, how do you expect to still represent education when you're a principal? She said, no. I'll always be a teacher. I said, no. You are literally working against the interest of teachers. And that ties into what Chris said. What are you doing? If you're making $300,000 a year, are you still working class? If you're a principal making close to six figures in a different union than teachers, where you are fundamentally opposed to allowing them to have control, because as a principal, you want your autonomy to have control, who's a better representative? Somebody who cares about labor and is going to fight with labor, or somebody who was called later on a class traitor for moving up and out of being an educator, not because they've sold out necessarily to capitalism, but due to the fact that they've jumped at their first chance to try to curry favor with the next ladder up and the next rung up, versus the teacher who's still struggling with the homework and the special needs kids and everything they're fighting for. And that came to my attention. I love that Chris just pointed that out as well. Where's that line? And do you lose yourself at some point? And I believe you do. I believe you do lose yourself at some point.
Well, especially when that differential, I mean, Because it'd be one thing if the principal made $250,000 a year, but the teachers all made at least $100K, even the part-timers. But that's not the case. There are teachers in this country making like $25,000 a year to do a very hard, serious job.
This was 10 years ago, but my son's other parent, when they got into education, it was Mississippi. They were making under $30,000 a year. And no, it wasn't even 10. It was 2014. So 7 years ago, somebody with a master's degree was making under $30,000 a year as a full-time teacher. So not only were you anecdotally pointing that out, but I knew of a actual case study of this happening.
I bring the facts, folks. So so there are teachers in this country making $25,000 a year. And some of them are working in schools where the administrators that make the decisions for them are making $500,000 a year in that same school system. So you've got administrators making decisions about you that make $500,000 a year, and you're making $25K. And you're expected to believe that administrator cares about your interests?
So let's just also be very clear and very direct. And this is a real classic example of former President Obama's grift, where in a country where there are school systems that have administrators making $500,000 a year, teachers' unions are the problem.
Chris, you put it so succinctly.
Now, I'm going to put this up here because this is good. I don't think this is as big a deal in the city council as it is in Congress, but that is a good question. We saw how 6 figures a year changed some of our Congress people.
What did he mean? Obviously, he's speaking about the Democratic Party and capitulating to their commands. So ultimately, I can say this, if I did interpret it correctly, no one in the establishment, be it Democrats, be it independents who may want to get involved after I've won, will have any control over me. The only people who will have a say in the motions I bring forth and the legislation that I present as a city council member are the people who elected me, and then our neighbors in the other wards. I'm 1 vote of 7. And whether you are a janitor, whether you are a hospitality worker, or you are a multimillionaire in the city of Las Vegas, all of your votes count the same. And to me, your voices are all going to be heard. But I know in my city that the voices that have been trampled upon for too many generations will get a greater hearing from me than those who have been spouting nonsense for nearly as long. And so while I will work with Democrats, being a Democrat myself, and I will work with, quote, establishment Democrats, I will never, ever allow the influence peddling of the establishment Democrats to allow for me to lose my values and the values that were instilled and entrusted in me by the voters of the city of Las Vegas. So I can make that statement now, and I would resign. The moment that I do, I would welcome you guys to come back to Uncivil Disobedience and replay this. I would rather, and I've said it before, I will be a swing vote. Currently, it's a 3-3-1 city council with a very right-leaning independent mayor as the 4th vote. When I win, it's going to shift to a center left. But guess what? I'm not running to be elected center left. I'm running to win and instill unabashed, progressive ideals and ideas. And if it's going to be a 6-1 vote for the first 2 years, easy enough. We'll just primary the others, and then we'll have a 4-3 vote or more come the next 2 years. So the Democratic establishment, and I'll get to you in a moment, Patty, but the Democratic establishment, if anything, will heal to us as progressives, because that's where our city is going, that's where our state is going, and that's where our nation is going.
I know that there's some fallout that handicapped the victory, but I know that they had a big takeover of the Nevada State Party a while back.
It was amazing in March, and I am a huge fan of Madam Chair Judith Whitmer, along with Secretary Aday, Vice Chairman Iqbal. It's tremendous vision that sits now upon our state party. Patty B, Michelle Fiore did not run unopposed in 2017 with an 8 or 9% voter turnout. She won by 2 points. The district is currently +2R. And so she did run opposed the last time. She won, squeaked it out. She had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to receive approximately 4,500 votes. This year is going to be the first election that's going to be even year elections versus odd year. So we're going to be on the ballot with the governor, senator, et cetera. But we're also, thanks to the progressive leadership in Nevada, going to have universal mail-in balloting across the board. So it's going to be a turnout. And I have no issues telling Michelle Fiore. And interestingly enough, when Michelle Fiore heard that I was running against her, speaking of being scared, she sent me a message directly, text. She said, big mistake. Well, Michelle Fiore, the only mistake that has been made was by you not announcing that you're going to either step down or choose to run for a different office. Because ultimately, when I beat you, your attempts at grifting will forever be done, because you'll have lost to a transgender democratic socialist who will have made you run and cower in a way that your bullying has allowed you to escape thus far. Because ultimately, I know the truth. Michelle Fiore, you are a coward, you're a crook, you're a grifter, and you're done.
I want to talk a little bit about running for local office versus running for a larger office, to what extent you need the DNC, because I want to try to help address some of this stuff in the comments as well. There is a reason why I'm always telling people, if they talk on Twitter, maybe I should run for office, I say run for something as small as you freaking can stand to, basically. Because when we talk about needing the party to run, if you're trying to run for Senate, you need your state party. You can't avoid it. You can't. And so if you are trying to run for Senate as a leftist, you're either going to get shut out or you're going to compromise. Okay? That's just the way it is. Because you're trying to reach your entire state. Even if you live in a state like mine with not very many people, that's still a lot of people. So, running for Senate, you got to have the tools of your party so that you can reach those voters. You need all of that back end information about who your voters are, how to reach them, etc. It's critical. But when you're running for a smaller office, those tools are still good, but they aren't game breaking, because you can figure out who your voters are if your district is small enough, all on your own. And I've known some people who did it and won.
You're going to love this, Kennedy and Chris, and to those who are watching. Just what Kennedy said. I wanted to make sure that I had autonomy in my campaign. Now, my party knows that I come out here and do the podcast. My party knows that I am out there protesting and I'm out there coming up with solutions. And oftentimes I inform our state party what I'm going to do before I do so. However, it's with the understanding that because there's a significant amount of alignment, that I do it more out of formality and respect than permission. What did I want to do in order to have this autonomy? You talked about knowing the voters. I said, what would the Republicans do if Michelle Fiore ends up not running, or if Michelle does run? What can I do to preclude this from really hurting me? I went ahead to a Republican data program from the Koch brothers, I-360, And because it was a nonpartisan race, I purchased their data. So not only was I able to freeze out anybody wanting their data in that particular ward, but I also went ahead and took control of my data operations myself. I went ahead and bought a text messaging program where I'm able to basically run my own campaign autonomously and on an island from anybody wanting to be able to corrupt my message. So if I don't want a person, I've been interviewed by several political consultants who decided, Sarah, we like you. We can't touch your race. It's too hot. I said, not a problem. I can't work with anyone who won't buy in to the notion that my message and my candidacy is the proper way forward for Ward 6 and for the city of Las Vegas. I respect that you don't want to get involved because ultimately you have a business, you have a brand. I respect that. And you've told me up front, respect that. However, in the end, the decision making is going to be by me, but it's also going to be a collective. It's going to be based on what the people of the district want, the ward, I should say, actually, Ward 6, as well as the entire sort of district and city and community, because you're going to have overlap countywide. We have 700,000 people approximately in the city, 2.2 million in the county. So again, I want to hear from everyone. And then I want to bring that message, that collective message to the voters of my ward and give them a clear choice. This is X, this is Y, who are we deciding on? And I believe they're going to go ahead and decide on Sarah Ashton.
Now, I bring this up because I get where they're coming from, but I'm not sure I agree. These are different times in a different political atmosphere. Focus on local offices is increasing as voters start to realize what's at stake. You sound like having their backing is a bad thing.
I love that. I'm going to cut you off, Chris, and I want Patty to hear this. Again, I love our state party. I love our county party. The first people that I consult with on making a big decision is going to be our county party hierarchy and our state party, because I respect them so much. Now, I want the backing. And in Nevada, it just so happens that our state and county is run by DSA. But I do embrace it, Patty. So, Chris, I'm sorry to have cut you off, but I wanted to make that very clear. I am learning as much from the leaders of our state and county parties as I am from having understood politics as a campaign strategist, successful one myself, before getting involved in as a candidate, which is entirely different.
That makes sorry.
I definitely don't think there are definitely local races that have gotten high stakes. On my other show, Not Safe for Wonks, we talked a bunch about city council races in Seattle getting increasingly expensive. And things like that a few times.
Well, when Jeff Bezos has a dog in the race, then money's going to start just looking crazy,
pouring in. So there's definitely is a lot at stake at times. I'm not trying to deny that. I'm just trying to say, in general, in this country, there's a lot of local offices that are a lot more winnable. And I definitely wouldn't say that necessarily having the backing of the party is a bad thing, but it is something where if you're not careful, you're going to be forced to compromise. There are some people that find themselves in just the right situation where they're running in a district that like nobody hardly wants to run in, and they can just run however they want and the party will still back them. That does occasionally happen, and that's cool when that happens. And people should take advantage of opportunities like that if it suits them, and etc. But you got to be careful of those offers. Ooh.
Well, Michelle Fiore herself actually ran into this, because I do have some history with Michelle. And again, so there's animus there, but it also makes me very potent against her. And Michelle was running. She was running in a small down ballot assembly race or state senate. She was going to win about a decade ago. And Steve Wynn approached her and said, you should run for Congress. We got you. We got you, Michelle. She did a lot of work in the state senate race. She ends up dropping out to run for Congress, and they dropped her. And that was a lesson that forever stuck with me, when deciding to run what I was going to run for myself. And ultimately, it gets back to the word I've used several times, autonomy. And I don't want to be in a position where I'm beholden to anyone until I have the opportunity to have a much bigger say in my own race. Right now, I have very good presence with media. You know, I'm seeing you, as you gentlemen, as Chris knows and as Kennedy knows. Sorry, Kennedy. I've had some write-ups, some very positive press, some interesting press. I feel comfortable in my lane, especially because my passion is with the city of Las Vegas. My son is a native of Las Vegas. My adulthood came about 2004 to 2021 in and around, for the most part, Las Vegas. So why would I want to make a statement by running for Congress? As an example, when not only can I get so much done for my community, but it's driven from real passion and I'm electable. It's not just running to put a message out. I'm running to get progressives a vote on the city of Las Vegas City Council, and to do it in a way that will allow all of us to be able to push forward and be able to say, okay, if this person can win in a swing district, plus 2R is a swing district, on an unabashedly progressive platform, then anyone can win in the United States in any race.
It makes sense to me.
I mean, I think, every time we put a moderate up in those mild R districts, what happens? Yeah, we take a big fat L. But because again, like we said, what's going to bring people over from the other side? You're going to bring people over by promising them something that could actually affect their lives. As a progressive, you're uniquely positioned to offer actual solutions to problems that face people all around you in your city. And so that's more likely to sway that sort of soft conservative who's not really that dedicated to the Republican Party, just kind of votes with them in general, but, might look at your platform and say, and we see that in some races. Whereas on the other hand, if you toss Charles Booker out in favor of Amy McGrath, you lose. You lose big time because that doesn't change minds.
It turns out that people in Kentucky who want reactionaries already have Mitch McConnell and don't need someone else.
We talked about this. How did I get involved with this extremist movement? How was I going to write my book? Where did it come from? The school I went to was just across the Ohio River in southern Indiana, where I lost my virginity, in St. Meinrad, Indiana, which is about 40 minutes from Louisville. And it's also where I became aware from being a guest on a farm, working on a farm in Louisville, near Louisville, actually Hart County, where I went ahead and saw just how extreme the MAGA movement was and how real life Nazis existed within range of a large city, meaning Louisville. You're talking 45, 50 minutes away. And so when people talk about the reactionary, or people say they want choices, you're never going to get the vote of the Nazi, right? If you're Amy McGrath, what are you thinking? Because the Nazi will never vote for you.
So that's the problem. If you're Amy McGrath, you don't get that the Nazi will never vote for you because you think that they will see you as one of them because you're a veteran, because you're conservative, because you're saying the sort of things that they want and sucking up to their leader, Trump. But the thing is, they know that if you were really willing to be that out and out Nazi, you wouldn't have that D after your name. You might be a Nazi, but you're going to hide it.
And they have litmus tests, Chris.
Yes.
The Nazis have litmus tests in the way it's unfathomable. And I'll say this, many of the Proud Boys I associated with were not Nazis, right? I've met Nazis. I was with Nazis on the farm, and I've also been with some Proud Boys who clearly were militia Nazi types. However, one thread across all of them, they have litmus tests. And how was I able to infiltrate and get them to buy into me? They're so stupid that it's like an AI chatbot. And if I'm just spouting back what they say and it's rah, 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 they're going to accept you because they can't process anything else. In a case of an Amy McGrath, where she's trying to, parse words and virtue signal, maybe not to Nazis, but to the right wing, then guess what? They will never buy it because they can tell that you're parsing. You have to come right out, look them in the eye, and then you can laugh about them afterwards and say, wow, I'm trying to get a socialist Supreme Court justice elected in Nevada. Well, I don't think Ozzy was actually a socialist, but a very progressive Supreme Court justice elected in Nevada while I'm going to your rallies in the daytime. And if you were smart enough, you would open up any of my social media feeds, as the Washington Post saw, and see that I was, wearing a Palestine jersey or something like that, if they even knew what Palestine was. However, the moderate Dems don't get that. The moderate Dems don't get, and I said this in either the Daily Beast or the Wash Po, they only buy absurdity, right? The far right only buys into the notion of absurdity. And so therefore, the further out you go, the more they embrace you.
Yeah.
Trump or any of these other Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton or any of these idiots, these fools, right? These grifters, the establishment Dems or the Lincoln Project type Republicans, even worse, they don't get that there's no reasoning with these people. There's no logic with these people. It's because of their litmus test. It's their way or death.
Yeah.
Or as you said, you have to go through deprogramming, right, Kennedy? Like you have to actually try to deprogram them.
Yeah, because they're in a cult. A very dangerous one. So I guess let's address this first.
This is important to address, actually. This is a great question. This is going to come up a lot for a lot of people.
I'm going to give you a half an easy way out, though, before you give whatever answer you want to give, though, which is just to say that, Sarah's running a very local race and to an extent only has to be accountable to the politics of her region. And the Democratic Party was taken over in Nevada. Yeah. It is a unique situation. If I lived in Nevada, I would be less skeptical of someone with a D next to their name, especially if it was someone with a great platform that I could literally just reach out to on Twitter, So I think that we have to keep in mind the regionalness of an election like this and the fact that, you really don't have to. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Quaker Socialist is getting at and who they're speaking for right now and all that. And especially in my own state, I have my own feelings about the state party here that are different. But I also think, you don't have to be accountable to the national feelings of the movement at this point.
I did like what they said, though. They mentioned BS meter. And basically, how can you prove authenticity? And I made that decision. So I declared in April, and I asked myself that same question. How can I not only live to my values, but how can people rest assured that if they back me, they're not backing, not even a Trojan horse, but they're not backing a wet towel that's just going to fold. That's the bigger problem. And yes, Nevada is unique in the sense that we overthrew the establishment there through democracy. It was literally direct action. DSA direct action took over the state party. And now there's lingering issues with the establishment, of course, but we have 2 years to show why this was a proper pathway to go on. But as for me directly, 2 reasons to be able to back up and push aside concerns by those who can see bullshit. And I'll say The BS meter stands for bullshit. Number one, when I'm out there, anything that somebody asks me, I'm going to put on record. There's never going to be an equivocation. Now, there may be something where I say, I don't know. I stand here right now, but explain to me why I should change. I can learn, I can listen, I can understand. But there will never be an equivocation where I will attempt to, again, parse my words and speak with this sort of mixture of a word salad and diarrhea. And all of a sudden you are like, what is she saying? Second is through direct action, which is a big issue among, DSA members and anybody in the progressive movement, third parties especially. What has this person done? And what is this person doing? When I went and stood with more than a hashtag, and I'm calling out a sheriff or a district attorney for being accomplices to murder, and I end up on the front page for it, I understand that some people may be aghast by it. But what it is for me telling those who are willing to support me and willing to organize for me, willing to create direct action for my campaign, which is in a sense our campaign, that no one is going to stop me now, this early, when I should be trying to ingratiate myself with those power brokers that want my ear now, let alone once we start to pick up the momentum that will allow us to move forward and achieve victory. And so whether it was marching in for Medicare for all, whether it was standing up for this murder victim, Jorge Gomez, whatever it may be, I gave to a mutual aid direct abortion society, not Planned. I mean, I support Planned Parenthood. It's where I was able to get my hormones for the first time. But I gave to a mutual aid abortion called the Wild West Fund. And I did so openly. Why? Because some people can't make it to Planned Parenthood. And it doesn't mean that those people don't deserve to be able to have choice over their body. And it also doesn't mean that I have to claim pro-choice when an organization says we are doing this for abortion. Great news. It's still pro-choice. And I may still personally never want to partake if I can't do it anymore. When I was younger, I had a child that was completely unexpected, and the child came and is now in this world. However, if somebody wants to use the term abortion, I'm not going to be afraid of it. And I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and say, you have the right to have an abortion. You don't just have the right to be pro-choice. You have such autonomy that you can choose to go in there, and I can't ask you why. And so it's moments like that that separate those of us who truly will fight for the causes that matter. Sometimes they matter in the shadows, sometimes they're out in public. But I will always fight for the causes that matter to bettering our society and bettering our democracy and bettering the republic that we exist within right now, as opposed to ever looking at Chris or Kennedy or anybody else I may be speaking to and asking them support me because it's my words. Support me because it's my actions, and support me because the thoughtfulness behind my planks, which equal my words, will show you that thought went into the ideas and ideals that we all share. Sorry, I was passionate because I hate politicians. And so I became very passionate about that question, not because I was upset by it, but I truly hate the political industrial establishment, even on the local level, because that's where some of the greatest grift comes from. And without stamping out that grift, then we will never be able to truly have our voices heard.
Yeah, I know in New Jersey the biggest corruption is at the county Democratic Party level, and it goes up from there because everyone gets inducted into it at the very beginning at the county level when they join the county party.
one of the most interesting aspects of my quote infiltration is that there were a lot of Republicans, a lot of high-ranking Republicans that knew I was a progressive, that knew I had socialist values. I wasn't DSA at the time, DSA now, but they wanted my business. They wanted the business of the candidates that I could bring them. And what that allowed me to do was then infiltrate the Nazi type, white supremacist type, rank and file MAGA people. But at the higher level, they all knew. And they didn't just stop. They were so greedy that even after the first news articles came out, they were still sharing information with me. And so when I said it, yes, when I said in that FBI statement, and it was great, I went to the state party and I said, FBI wants to speak to me. I said, one of the e-board members, one of the executive board members, Sarah, you can't speak to the FBI. I said, I know. I said, what should I do? Because I have a tremendous amount of information. He said, well, first get counsel. 2, put it out there, which I managed to do through the media. I did have contact with the FBI through messaging, through attorney, but I didn't sit with them. And one of the most interesting aspects was, up until I announced against Michelle in June, I was still getting information fed to me by Michelle's allies. It's one of the reasons I chose to run against her, because I knew, and you can see in one of my announcements, I said, I can't wait to see the very last sentence. I can't wait to see Michelle's financial affairs. They were so hungry, Chris and Kennedy, to utilize me as sort of a go-between to bludgeon each other, that they chose to make a deal with the Scorpion. And I never signed an NDA, never took money. And there's that one text message with a very, very high-ranking GOP member, politician. And this person said, you have a book there. And I said, I have many books. And when they flipped out in realizing just what I had, that's when the real hate came. So everybody wanted to run Proud Boys, Proud Boys, Proud Boys. To me, the story is the second part that is going to be the book. It's the grift of the Republican Party to the fact that they worked with a socialist, a transgender progressive socialist, in order to fight each other and grift. I have a message from one of them, actually from Michelle. Michelle says, why don't you start a socialist party? I said, Michelle, the DSA has that covered. I said, I don't need to. But they knew it. They were literally referring to me as a socialist. One of them called me I'm not a communist, but one of them called me a communist. They couldn't help themselves. They revealed everything to me, Chris. Kennedy, everything. It's when you talked about a book being published, publishers should look this up for no other reason. The Proud Boys stuff, yes, it was real, disgusting, and gave me insight. But those guys were easy. Because those guys, as I said, you just mimic it back to them and they're like, rah, rah, rah. No, the real story is how the GOP sold their soul in Nevada to me. And offline or, off camera, I'm happy to share some of those messages with you. So many messages to the point I get contacted by ProPublica just today. I do so much background for these people, even in the stories that I will never write about myself, only because you can only go in so many directions, or they need confirmation. We're talking things as recent as July 26th. I think the communication only stopped first week of June. They're doing a guy by the name of Ryan Miner in Maryland is doing a story because the grifters from Nevada are trying to grift in Maryland. And I'm doing a podcast with him Wednesday night. He's doing investigative journalism into a group called the McShane Group, which were the ones that contacted me about getting in touch with the Proud Boys. So what's their big game is they like to go to candidates and tell them, they literally extort candidates. If you don't sign with us, we're going to run somebody against you. And this is extortion. And they've admitted it in text messages to me. And now they're doing it in Maryland, and they're onto them in Maryland. And Miner came out with a story today, and then he's going to expound on it apparently Wednesday night. I'm going to go and talk to him a little bit about just this particular part of the GOP in Nevada. And that's how I know the GOP, if we are correct in our approach as progressives, will eventually lose to us hearts and minds of the people, as well as great question, Patty. One moment, and I will get to that. And it was addressed in Daily Beast and Washington Post, but I'll get to it much further in just a moment if Chris and Kennedy don't mind. But what I've seen about the Republican Party is that they're willing to win primaries and line their pockets. That means if we organize correctly, we will continuously win general elections. And that's why in Nevada we've been so successful, even though it's a purplish state, because ultimately they don't know how to win actual races. So I think we have a 3%, we normally win by 3% every presidential election, should be swing districts. And yet we have a near supermajority in the assembly, 5 out of 6 constitutional officers at state level, 3 out of 4 congresspeople, and both senators. Why? Because they care more about winning primaries and making money off of suckers than running good candidates. And I'm sorry, I'm speaking a lot, but I'm very passionate about this topic. So I apologize, Chris and Kennedy, on this.
No, it's fine.
Keep going.
Patty asked a question, and it was addressed. June 22nd, I remember the date well, because it's in the book. The book's been started. A friend of mine, very close friend, she was running for judge. She was a Democrat, but much more of a libertarian. I'll say that, much more of a libertarian. So extremely socially liberal, but with some areas on, say, guns and other issues that would preclude her from ever being anything but a libertarian. Mm-hmm. But she was a Democrat and young, attractive judge, mid-40s. It's her birthday tomorrow, actually. And she was not a judge yet. She was a candidate. And we were talking about her race. And I told her, basically, we have to win this race for you. Because the guy she was running against was the epitome of what is wrong with the Democratic establishment. 70-year-old lawyer, name on a building, and old white guy. He would rule, it didn't matter the D or the R, he would rule in favor of his friends. And he looked so stereotypically lawyerish that everybody thought he was a Republican. So I told my friend, I said, the only way we win this race is we appeal to Republicans and nonpartisan race. And she was aghast at the notion. She said, I can't switch. I said, well, if you want this guy to be judge and you not be judge, but if not, we switch you and we can get you a victory. Weekend of the Trump rally, the big Trump vote rallies were taking place. She still wasn't a Republican, but her opponent said that the Constitution was a living, breathing document. Wow. We're walking the beach. You have this trans person, me, you have her, she's walking, and all these rabid Trump supporters. And they said, you're the only politician down here running. Are you a Republican? And I told her as her campaign manager, I said, whatever you do, don't answer. You just tell them your opponent said the Constitution's a living, breathing document. Oh my God. It didn't matter. Once we walked that beach, they loved her. And ultimately that put us onto the path of her switching parties. And we ended up overcoming her opponent. Her opponent was endorsed by governor, former senator, U.S. senator, sitting congresswoman, sitting district attorney, all 3 newspapers, and multiple unions. And we beat him by 11 points. However, I had started, and I mentioned Louisville. I had already started working in February of 2020. I went to LA to write what would be my 4th book. I've published 2. One is unpublished. This was going to be my 4th. Talking about my time, Patty, since you asked the question, I'll address it directly. My time on this farm in Hart County, Kentucky, where I became engaged with the wife / mother was a literal daughter of a Nazi. Her father had been an SS member at 15 years old at the end of World War II. The father was a white nationalist who could trace his lineage in the Confederacy. And they lived in this homestead, 40 acres, 5 little houses, preparing for the end of the world. And I had been dating their daughter. And I'd met their daughter in Berlin when I was finishing my book on Muslim refugees, 2015. I never met her. I met her family for one day in 2016, but didn't know anything about her family. This girlfriend of mine, she was a cosmopolitan opera singer. She was a choir director for a gay and lesbian choir. I mean, she went to May Day parades with me in Berlin, where May Day parades are legit, right? So, I mean, I had no idea. We get to Kentucky, Patty, and it's January of 2018. And I ended up spending 3 months with them on that farm. Her father broke his ribs, and I did not look like this at the time. And so I was a country farmer, and I became exposed to the pathological insanity, right? It was a pathology, and the psychopathy. And I know the difference between psychopathy, sociopathy, et cetera. I'm using the psychopathy of these people when it came to some of their beliefs. And at dinner one night, the father says to me, I had not voted in a presidential election since 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Trump gave me hope. And so to give you some idea of my background, this woman had known I was trans, even though I wasn't transitioning. My son's mother was an undocumented immigrant. I had been married to her. My brother literally is married to a Nigerian woman. My niece and nephews are Nigerian, and my business partner was a non-practicing Jew. So it's not as though I had experience with Nazis, right? And I'm a progressive myself, spent the time with the Muslim refugees, Occupy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, having just finished the Muslim refugee book and having just finished my first novel, I called my son's mother and I said, I have a problem. I'm on this farm with these psychos. I'm seeing things that are astounding. And yet, I don't want to leave because I have a book here. I have a story here. I'm able to see these people waiting for the end of the world, and I'm listening to what they're showing me, and I would see videos. There was no fun. You worked on the farm, and they had a saying. In German, it was Blut im Boden, which was blood and soil, right? You're giving to the fatherland, and they would laugh about that. And so they were preparing for the end times, certain it was going to come. And I said, do I stay here? Do I go? And basically, she told me, get out of there. But my brother and my business partner both told me, fuck them and stay, because ultimately your presence matters more if you can get this story out. So I stayed there as long as I could. I stayed there 3 months. I couldn't take it past 3 months. And the father got healed and I got out of there. And I broke up with the girl. That was it. That was the end. I told her, your father and mother are Nazis, right?
Was there something about that relationship?
Well, I'll tell you what it was. I'm glad you brought this up, and I have the text, and it's on Instagram, actually. It's on my Instagram, always been Sarah. My response to her when she wrote me after the breakup and told me basically she had been with me the entire time in order to try to get me not to be trans. And that I turned away from God and I would live in darkness. And that's why the Ruth Gaos situation, being in Kentucky, mattered so much to me. That's why it truly, not just us as Democrats and us as progressives, it reminded me too much of somebody who presented themselves as a Democrat or, as meaning the daughter, and yet would be willing to say something so similar to what Ruth Gaos' church said. And so I still to this day have my response up there, basically telling her, I never knew you. And so that was 2018. We fast forward, I transitioned. We fast forward to February 2020. I go to LA to write the story of living on this farm as a trans person. It was going to be potentially movie form, but I had scripted out the first 50 pages. And then I said, well, maybe short stories based on the whole thing. So it was a work in progress. I said, I'm going to leave Vegas and I'm going to go to LA, ensconce myself there, and just write. COVID hits 2 weeks later. As an analyst, and I'm in Phoenix right now, as an analyst, I've done healthcare analytics. And so a good friend of mine who has a healthcare company across 3 states, she said, what are you doing? And I had only done property analytics up to that point. I'd never been in healthcare. I do healthcare now. I said, nothing. She said, we have COVID. What the hell's going on? Can you come on board? And so I gave up the writing to go work as an analyst for COVID. Like I was literally in the early days on phone calls with the LA Department of Health being told, we have no PPE. Don't ask us for it. We don't know what's going on. You're on your own. I would be in Pasadena trying to come up with masks, going to Home Depot. Oh my gosh. Okay, let's wrap this up. And so ultimately what I learned was the story could still be told, Patty, but it had to be paused. This election cycle in 2020 opened it up for me to get a much bigger story with the Republicans, thanks to this candidacy that my friend was running and the fact that they wanted liberal business from me, progressive business, which I sent them. The first, and I'll end it up, the first message I have confirming that they knew was in September of 2020, well before the whole Proud Boy thing happened, where they said, if we get this other candidate elected, that will be 2 socialists that we got elected for you, Sarah. And that came from one of the biggest Republican consultants in the state. They knew, and the infiltration was really just willful dissonance by them until it's clearly come back to bite them, because a lot more is coming out. A lot more is going to come out. That's a long way of answering, Patty, and I know I kind of took you on all kinds of places, but the story is convoluted. But if you look at it, it led from A to B to C, and it ties into the Ruth Gaos situation because it reminded me too much of what I literally experienced in Kentucky myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to expose that game, because a lot of this is a game for these people. It is not. That's part of the problem with somebody like going all the way back to Amy McGrath for just 1 second before we get out of here. That's part of the problem with somebody like that, is that the real hardline conservatives / fascists, they know what game they're playing, and they know that Amy McGrath is not playing that game.
Mm-hmm.
Period. So yeah, I think that's really
invade the same
fascinating.
countries.
Sarah, I hope we get the chance to have you on again sometime, because
This was amazing.
there's so much more that we could talk about.
Yes, you guys are every bit as amazing as I anticipated. The two of you make a phenomenal combo. Best podcast. Uncivil Disobedience is the podcast to tune into.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
We appreciate that. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for the platform. Thank you for the time. And y'all are amazing. So I know you have to run. Thank you, Kennedy. And thank you, Chris, again. Sarah Ashton, electsarah.com or Sarah Ashton LV on Twitter. Bye.
You knew what we were about to ask.
And she's definitely worth following on Twitter. I will say I would be following her even if she weren't running for anything.
Thank you, Chris.
And on that note, as far as final thoughts go, the one bit of news that I wanted to make sure to mention before I went is that we have some of the first news from Israel about how effective and not effective COVID vaccines are, where Israeli doctors took much more care in finding out which sick people had been vaccinated and which haven't than American doctors have been. And one of the things they found, let's go with the Pfizer vaccine, that's the one that they were using most heavily and the ones we have the numbers on. The Pfizer vaccine was advertised as 88% effective. And what the actual numbers are, according to the Israeli doctors who have been seeing it work out in the real world, is it's 88% effective to avoid symptoms serious enough that you die or go to the hospital. So there's only a 12% chance that you'll die after getting the Pfizer vaccine, which is a really good reason to get it. Let's be clear about that. The fact that there's only a 12% chance you'll die if you get the Pfizer vaccine is a really good reason to get vaccinated. However, and this is a big however, as far as not catching it or not passing it on to someone else, it's about 33% effective. And those numbers are important to understand. They're important to understand when we think about whether or not we're going to wear a mask in a specific situation. They're important to think about when determining what the risks are in a certain situation. And so my last thought to you to think about before we sign off is that if we open up schools the way Joe Biden wants, the way Joe Scarborough said this morning that we have to, we are going to be releasing unvaccinated children who cannot be vaccinated yet, because remember, it's 12 and up. We are going to be releasing unvaccinated children into a situation where their teachers, even if they're all vaccinated, still have a 67% chance that they could catch and spread the virus, which means the kids get sick, the kids make each other sick, the kids go home and make their parents sick, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of sick vaccinated people wandering around getting more unvaccinated people sick while they watch their kids get sick and possibly die. I'm not trying to be too much of a downer, but that's really the potential situation that we are looking at come September if something doesn't happen. And on that note, sorry for the bummer tonight, folks, but I really wanted to get that part of the news out there.
It's important.
I hope everybody has a good night. Please tweet at us. We'll tweet at you. And take care, folks.
Get vaccinated.
Definitely get vaccinated. Everybody have a great night.
Good night.